Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. Today's episode of Personal Exposure is about learning, ignorance, and a newly acquired independence. And of course, at the end of the video, I will also share some recommendations as always. The story really starts with my 30th birthday. That was a time when I really got into photography. So I didn't do a lot of photography before that. I was more or less a musician when it comes to my hobbies and passions. Played in bands, various bands for about 12 years. And this was my thing, kind of singing and playing the guitar and being on stage more or less. And I wanted to shift hobbies for various reasons. And at the time, all I had for a camera was a digital Samsung camera that I used to basically do some blogger portraits of my girlfriend at the time. So I really hadn't much of a clue, but I was inspired by the kind of results that I could get with it and wanted to acquire a real camera. And of course I did a lot of research back then and both kind of dipped my toes into analog photography and digital photography at the same time. And was kind of drawn towards analog photography or film photography. And what happened is that I made for me a huge investment at the time. I purchased a Leica T, a Leica M6 and a 50mm vintage Summicron more or less at the same time as a birthday present to myself. And decided, okay, I want to acquire a new skill, basically photography, and learn from scratch about exposure, about ISO settings, about focal length, and all the basics, basically. And what I did is, on the one hand, I used my Leica M6 to get a better understanding of film photography and do street shots, and I learned about correctly exposing film. And on the other hand, I used my Leica T for portraiture and getting compositions right and improving these skills. And basically my learning curve here is documented on this channel, but because I soon started out saying, okay, what I acquired as knowledge in my first year that was really rough with respect to film photography, I would like to share that and make that path and that learning curve even steeper for other people. But what I did back then was deliberately exclude important sections and pockets of film photography and photography in general, because I basically decided to focus on portraits and street photography. So I had no clue at all about landscape photography at the time. And with respect to film photography, I more or less excluded the entire post-production process. So what I did is, for 2 years or so, I just shot a lot of rolls of film, but I sent them off to a lab to have them scanned and developed. And of course I received feedback about my exposure and what I did wrong and what I did right, which I really appreciated, which added to my learning curve. But I didn't get a lot of exposure to actual negatives, so I was just kind of caught up in this hybrid process. And then of course slowly, before it dawned on me that this is a good and interesting thing to maybe broaden my knowledge, I was basically very ignorant. So this is the whole point. If you're excluding things, you're basically being ignorant. And the great thing about it is it's liberating. It is incredibly liberating because you can make quite some progress in a relatively fast fashion when focusing on certain things. And at the time, I felt like I'm doing pretty good with respect to portraiture because I got the first, in my opinion back then, and objectively good results, and considered myself a good portrait photographer just because of that. And of course, looking back at the time now, just 4.5 years later, not even, and looking at the results, I'm kind of embarrassed about them. And the thing here is, of course, I acquired new knowledge and I'm kind of facing my ignorance. And here I want to do a quick detour to understand, to explain that point better. And it revolves around the American postmodernist author Thomas Pynchon. And many of you will have heard of him. He's famous for novels like Gravity's Rainbow from 1973, or more recently Against the Day, which was published in 2006, a real magnum opus, or Inherent Vice in 2009, which was also adapted into a feature film by P.D. Anderson. So you might have heard about Thomas Pynchon. He's also famous for being a notorious recluse. So it's really one of the most reclusive authors out there. There is hardly any biographical or personal information about him. And one important piece of personal and autobiographical information that exists about him is coming from the introduction to Slow Learner, which is a collection of stories that he wrote at the very beginning of his career, between, I think, 1958 and 64. Some of the short stories were still written when he was in college. And he looks back at these stories when they are published in a collection in 1984, Slow Learner, a really fitting title, and he reflects on his learning process and also on the stories and how he has written them at the time. And it's a beautiful, amazing self-critique in a really precise fashion, but it also includes a lot of wisdom when it comes down to learning. And here I want to quote from this introduction to Thomas Pynchon's Slow Learner, quote, "Everybody gets told to write about what they know. The trouble with many of us is at the early stages of life, we think we know everything. Or to put it more usefully, we are often unaware of the scope and structure of our ignorance. Ignorance is not just a blank space on a person's mental map. It has contours and coherence and, for all I know, rules of operation as well." So as a corollary to writing about what we know, maybe we should add getting familiar with our ignorance and the possibilities therein for ruining a good story. And this is basically what's happening to me right now. In the current moment of time, I'm getting aware of my own ignorance when it comes to photography. And this is not just incredibly humbling, but also incredibly rewarding, because I'm basically being drawn to, what is landscape photography all about? What can I do with the use of filters? What can I do with flash photography? And what can I do when I actually post-process my film myself, either in a hybrid fashion, so really scanning them digitally, or increasingly learning by observing from Jules and Greg's activities. What can I do in a lab? And this, of course, if you are an older watcher of this channel, you're probably sitting in front of the screen cringing right now, like, these young people kind of disrespecting everything that we've built when it comes to lab knowledge and so forth. And this is not what I'm doing. I'm just being very open about the ignorance that I had in the beginning, and which for me was a really efficient shortcut and smart cut to get to a point that was very good and solid in terms of portrait photography and also street photography. But now I'm realizing, okay, there's a lot to catch up on, and this is interesting in my opinion. And part of that journey, and now I'm coming to the point here, is my scanner, which was featured in the last video, and most of the comments were asking about what kind of scanner is that, can you tell a little bit more about it? And it's an Epson F-3200, which is a scanner really created for the specific use of scanning film negatives. And it comes with a beautiful array of film holders, so for 4x5 inch film, for medium format film, and of course for 35mm film. It is really an optimized device for that particular use case, and it works wonderfully in terms of its quality, sharpness, and so forth. And for me, it also lives up to the strange expectations and needs that I always had to basically get a film scanner that is small and compact and that I can put away at any time. Because of course I observed the market back then and looked at what are the available scanners and how much do they cost. And for me it was always the same story. I looked at scanners thinking, okay, a flatbed scanner, it's really difficult to get the sharpness right here. Most of the cases it's not really possible to have them focus correctly on the film plane. So this is not an option for me. Then I saw the kind of acquisitions that Jules did in order to get amazing scanning results, and these were sometimes the size of a washing machine. And of course, if you make room for that and you have the space for it, it's a beautiful solution. But for me it was too big, too slow, and taking up too much space to get good results. And then there was this option of using a macro lens and using a digital camera to scan it, and I felt like, nah, it's also not what I want. I don't want to use my digital camera to do digital scans with that. So I basically was looking occasionally for scanners, and the few scanners that I found that had more of that kind of form factor that I have now were incredibly expensive. They ended up being 2,000 euros or something like that, and that of course put me off, and I said, okay, this is not the kind of investment that I want to do. I continue to send off my film to a lab and have it scanned there. And then what happened around Christmas last year, so basically 4 years into my film photography journey, is that Jules sent over a link to the Epson F-3200, basically being on sale by a private person here in Munich, and being really excited about it, saying, you should take a look at that. This is the kind of scanner that you should be getting. And he even mentioned if I would not have so many scanning solutions already, basically the washing machine size plus his digital camera plus additional versions, I would be really interested and inclined to get it. And it was 280 euros at the time, which I immediately, the economic side of me thought, okay, this is really interesting, because looking at how much I spend sending film off to a lab, I would get a return on invest pretty soon. And I decided to take a closer look at it. I wrote him and met with that person around Christmas and immediately fell in love with the scanner. And the interesting thing here is, when we talk about learning curves, this is the kind of person who told me, yeah, I love the scanner, it's incredibly useful, but it's also something that I've kind of left behind, in the sense of I moved on and now I'm purely interested in the complete analog process. So this was a person saying, yeah, I shoot mostly on film, but when I do so, I also want to actually enlarge my negatives and do proper prints of it. And he basically said, okay, I moved through that period of scanning and doing it hybrid in terms of the process, and now I move on. And for me, I was basically at the beginning of that process saying, yes, this is perfect for me. I want to do my own scans and learn all about it. And this is the period in which he hit me with a scanner, and I love it. I love using it. Of course, it encourages me to develop much more of my film myself, so doing all the black and white development myself. Right now, only sending C41 over to Jules with his Filmomat. He's well equipped to do stuff like that. And occasionally, I send a E6 development to a local lab and have it developed there. So significant change for me in my analog process, and still being able to scan the negatives myself and getting the kind of results that I was always looking for and that I was also used to. This was important to me. So a really long story about my humble learning curve and the ignorance that I basically brought to photography, but also kind of the indication that I'm providing here is how rewarding it can be to now learn about things that you've excluded so far on your learning journey and integrate them into your collective knowledge about photography. And this is what's happening with me right now. I'm doing a lot of experiments with flash photography on film, which is really exciting and rewarding. Learning about scanning and scanning my film correctly, and slowly but surely also about the use of filters and landscape photography. So sometimes when you do make comments about stuff like that, please always keep in mind that Jules and Greg are the experienced ones, and I'm the kind of the guy on a steep learning curve, being sometimes dragged along or curiously following along in these different directions. As always, I would like to end the episode with two recommendations. The first one goes all the way back to last summer when I was in Zurich together with Simon, when we did our Fuji TX1 review. So the other version of the Hasselblad X-Bun, which we reviewed back then. And if you haven't seen the review, I can highly recommend taking a look at it. And back then, it rained on us in the morning in Zurich, and we visited Ars Imago, that beautiful film photography only store. And I ran into Daniel Espinosa there kind of completely by accident, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Analog magazine. And the Analog magazine is being sold there at Ars Imago, and he was basically just dropping by in order to bring them new magazines. And he was such a nice person. It was really nice to talk to him and get to know him, and we just emailed afterwards, and he sent over a couple of the magazines, and I can highly recommend you taking a look at it. The Analog magazine is basically focusing on contemporary film photography and creative writing, and it's a beautiful combination that gets you in touch with up-and-coming artists. And at least personally, I got a lot of inspiration out of it, and I also saw what is possible with film today, and all the things, the creative output that you can create with it. And not just as a great established master of the past, but also as an up-and-coming artist doing that thing today. So highly recommended taking a look at the Analog magazine. Furthermore, our buddy Lucas, whom we have featured on the channel here before with his Filmomat automatic development machine, he released a new version of the Filmomat, the 2020 version, with rotational development, so a really reinvented Filmomat in many ways, with a completely different way of agitation, basically, which has the result that with the 500 milliliters of chemistry, you can do twice the amount of films, develop twice the amount of films, and you can even mix 35 millimeter and 120 film. And it apparently really works great. Jules has one of the Filmomat devices and just loves it. And Lucas just even released a video about it, so if you're interested in the latest version of the Filmomat, take a look there. We can highly recommend it if you're really focusing on film photography and have a complete film photography workflow, then yeah, at least consider this purchase. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy episode about my ignorance and failures when it comes to photography. And if you have any more questions, please leave us a comment in the comment section below. And as always, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thank you for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.